Okay. Wendy, would you offer our prayer this afternoon?
I will.
Thank you so much.
Our dear Father in heaven, we're grateful for the ability to be in this class, to wrap up our study of the French Revolution and the comparisons we've made to a revolution that thou was more closely involved in and was inspired by thee. It's been an interesting comparison, and makes us even more grateful for thy hand in the founding of our country. And we're thankful for our health and for our instructor in this school, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you very much, Lori. Excuse me, Wendy. Wendy, thank you, Wendy. Welcome to Christina. How are you?
Good.
Good, good. And Lori, are you still with us? Oh, no. Her microphone has stopped working. Well, okay, Lori, I would try plugging it in again. That's always something that I try. Not that I'm great at technology, but I try to plug it in again. You can click mute and unmute. Let's see. Unmute. Okay. Well, I guess you could always also try to log in again. That has worked in the past. Once again, I'm not sure if there's really a rhyme or reason that I can understand very well. But let's see. Are you trying any of those things, Lori? Okay. Okay, well, I'm sorry. And you can hear us, though, I assume. Okay, well, good. Well, then we'll hope that you can be with us in voice as well as in hearing. Okay, well, let's go then. And today I think we'll have a really an exciting class, lots of information, lots of great relating to gospel principles. It's such an interesting and sad and destructive era of human history that we'll talk about today, and there really are a lot of lessons. So we'll talk about how unbridled passion shattered reason's tower here during the Reign of Terror. Okay. Well, we've seen this picture before, but if you remember some of the things we talked about, what does this picture tell you about the Reign of Terror?
Well, it's good, and it's showing them stamping on symbols of religion and authority.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I love that connection, Wendy, because we'll see that even as they were saying life will be better when we base it on reason instead of religion, well, this is what happened when you had life based on reason instead of religion. It's a very interesting component of this picture here. We see the world aflame underneath a guillotine, and I think that's symbolic in many ways. What would you say, Christina?
Well, it's interesting because it's supposed to be all about reason, but this just looks like it just gives an emotion of just chaos and no religion, no reason, no anything. It seems like it kind of crumbles into that passion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that answer. It is so interesting. You see the banner, no God, no religion, no king, no constitution. They were so intent on changing the way things had always been, on, what they saw as an outdated mode of life, this, ancien régime, this, ancient order of things, the old order of things. It's so interesting that in their zeal to just change and change and change and change, they didn't look before they leaped, and here they are in a great picture that teaches us more about Proverbs 16:32. Welcome, Walter. We're happy you're with us. How are you today? Hi,
Good.
Walter. Walter, would you read this scripture for us, please?
Sure. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he taketh a city.
Thanks. Walter, what do you think this scripture has to do with the Reign of Terror in France?
Well, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and so someone who is slow to anger is better than uh, someone who's mighty. And uh, people during the French Revolution weren't really slow to anger; they were kind of fast to anger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent, right? Thank you so much for that. And it's so interesting because, it's all done supposedly in the name of France, in the name of protecting the liberty of the revolution, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll see where that leads to. So thanks so much for that, Walter, the reading and also that relating. Well, there's an interesting character here. Hopefully you've had a chance to read a little bit of Freedom is Lost by Jean-Paul Marat. He had a very interesting life. Today we'll look at him because he predicted a terrible outcome for the French Revolution, and then, unwittingly, he made his own predictions come true. In quite an ironic twist of history. And so let's see what happened and how he brought that about on himself and on the revolution in some ways. 1743 to 93, only 50 when he was killed. He was Swiss-born, French-speaking, physician, scientist, political philosopher, politician, and radical journalist of the French Revolution, part of the Mountain faction of the Jacobins. From September 1789 on, he wrote a newspaper that you read an excerpt of. You read an article from called L'Ami du Peuple, the Friend of the People. And it's so interesting that in this newspaper and then in other writings and as he was working with the Mountain, he was always this publicist, this informant, this rabble rouser, going around accusing countless people, especially important people in power, trying to tear them down with this precarious power that he'd been given in this new situation. He started pointing fingers at anybody and everybody. No one was safe, calling them all enemies of the people and calling for their punishment and in extreme cases, execution. To try to purge France of people who would tear it down as he saw. This can be compared very interestingly to, the Salem witch hunt. You've read The Crucible, Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism, looking at, communism in America in the 1950s, 53 particularly. It's so interesting to think about what happens when people become overzealous and the harm that they can do. And it's also interesting, too, that, he who lives by the sword ends up dying by the sword, because certainly Charlotte Corday, a Girondin supporter, she ended up murdering him for his radicalism, saying, quote, "I killed one man to save 100,000." And she was, interestingly enough, guillotined for her crime against Marat. Well, you may have seen this very famous painting by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Marat. So if we look at this here and we stare at this, what lessons can we learn from his life and his death?
Did you say he was murdered by a supporter? That woman was a supporter originally?
Well, a Girondin, a Girondist, which that was, we'll talk more about that later, but they were the conservative group in the National Convention, and the Mountain, which Marat was a part of, opposed them. They were similar in some ways because they were both behind a republic and a democratic popular revolution, but then they really differed as to the extent of the expression of that revolution, with the Jacobin Mountain faction being much more extreme, and the Girondins in French, or the Girondists, as you might say in English, being much more conservative. And so Corday was a Girondist supporter.
And how did she's the one who personally murdered him, and what is
Yeah.
is that what's happening in this picture, and do you know what he's writing there?
Sure. So she came in and she said, "Oh, I know that you like lists of people who are enemies to the cause of France, and so I have a list of some people from my region who you can then publicize and go after because they're really doing some bad things." And so he's like, "Oh, great, give me the list." And so she started giving him name after name after name, and he was copying them down. As you can see, he has the paper in his hand there. He's copying them down. The reason why he was in his bathtub is because he suffered from a terrible skin disease. He would soak himself for sometimes 7 hours a day trying to get rid of this skin disease. This was a daily ritual for him. And so he was in the bath doing his soaking and doing his writing, doing his work. They almost, think of, working on a laptop, portable. and here he is, and she brings in this information, which was false information. And then, as he was writing it down, she took out a very large kitchen knife and stabbed him. And so this is after he's been stabbed.
Well, lessons learned, just like that scripture you quoted, or not scripture, live by the sword, die by the sword, or what?
Hello? Hello, Wendy?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, well, I think you went out there for a few seconds, but now I can hear you.
Oh,
So you were saying live by the sword, die by the sword.
Yeah, or what goes around comes around. This is he fostered violence, and that, I guess he got it back in return.
Right. No, it's true, and so certainly as we think about relating this to ourselves, hopefully we'd never be in a situation like this, but certainly in more mild forms, what about something like gossip? I'm sure we've all been guilty of that at some time in our lives, and think about what that can do, and how this lesson might relate. Certainly, we don't want to spend too much time on the death of Marat, even though today is unfortunately a bloody day. But let's try to learn the lessons from it, and then hopefully it will help us to not commit those same mistakes. It's interesting as we reason and we think about this freedom is lost piece. I hope you got a chance to look at it. What does he think about? Because think of it, he's writing in 1791 at this point. He wasn't murdered until 1793. In 1791, France had a constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI had given in and said, okay, fine, we'll have a national assembly. I'll rule with you. Let's try this sort of uneasy new government. But what did Marat, what did Marat think about this constitutional monarchy of 1791?
Well, at the assembly?
I'm sorry?
I heard someone else who spoke.
Oh, sorry, that was me. I just got the impression that that he thought that those that were the representatives and the king were not doing a good job doing what I guess the revolution's goals were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for that. And it's so interesting because if you read the document closely, he's so suspicious. He's saying, it's just a matter of time before Louis XVI tries to throw off, these shackles that we put on him in this new constitutional monarchy. He's going to want the power, the absolute power that he had before. He's going to become a tyrant again. It's just a matter of time, to watch out. This is a terrible thing. You can't have this. You can't have this peace between the National Assembly and the monarch. It just won't work here in France. And so he's very, very suspicious. And certainly, also, he thinks about the assembly, and he's really looking at the assembly very, very critical. What does he say about the French National Assembly in this constitutional monarchy?
Vile and corrupt. His words have come to my mind many times when I've watched state and county politics happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Definitely, vile and corrupt. He's basically saying, hey, we started with the right intentions, and now you're ruining it for everybody because of this corruption. You're working with a tyrant. Perhaps you're even in league with him at this point. Now that you've gotten power, the goals of the revolution are being trampled. On one hand, you tell people that liberty will roll all the tyrants of the universe in the dust, but yet, he says, you think that a few ridiculous phrases were enough to crush the countless enemies of freedom. He's saying you're all talk and no action. You're not cutting it, National Assembly. You're not getting the job done. Because, obviously, even in 1791, he's talking about the countless enemies of freedom. And he's saying the National Assembly is not doing enough to take care of them, to round them up, to imprison them, or even worse. And so certainly this is a vicious indictment against them. And so what does he call for? He says, hey, we have this bad situation. What should we do, according to him?
Well,
and this is go ahead.
At the end, he just says there remains no means of putting off your ruin. But earlier he says, why haven't you ever followed my advice? And I assume that earlier he had tried to get people to kill people to kill their enemies.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because think of it, the whole newspaper, it was the friend of the people, almost like a Dear Abby. You know, people write to Dear Abby. Well, they wrote to the friend of the people. He was the friend. You know, and so he said, you know, you haven't listened to the advice of your friend, meaning me, the friend of the people. You know, you haven't armed yourself with rope, with daggers, and ended the days of those of your defeated enemies who would have the audacity to rise up again. So he's saying, you know, this is much too milquetoast. This is much too moderate of a revolution. It's not going to accomplish what it set out to accomplish because you're taking the middle road, and it needs to be more extreme. There are enemies around you, and you need to rise up and seek them out. Well, you know, it's very interesting because he has this very, very famous prediction about the fate of the monarchy under Louis XVI, and then about the course and the outcome of the French Revolution. This is 1791. It's very, very interesting. What does he say? What are his predictions? I hope that you saw these.
Well, he talks about factions, about the Republic being torn up into factions, and then I think he said somewhere else just about another tyrant to take the place. That basically he kind of predicted what ends up happening with the different anarchy followed by, you know, Napoleon and things like that. He just seems to kind of lay it out like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. In fact, Christina, would you read the second to last paragraph, starting with all the ambitious, who the cupidity, which is an excessive desire for wealth?
Sure. Okay. All the ambitious who the cupidity of the court can no longer satisfy and the public functionaries it can no longer corrupt will throw themselves into this party. The successive uprisings will be followed by a general uprising, and the satellites and the privileged henchmen of the prince will fall beneath the blows of the discontented. He himself will be thrown from the throne and proscribed along with his unworthy family. The kingdom will be torn apart by different factions. From the fire of civil dissension, several federated republics will be born. The most audacious and skillful citizens will usurp the empire, will subject the multitude to a new yoke, and the government will have changed form without having reestablished freedom.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Amazing, just amazing. What are the sequence, what are the steps in the French Revolution as it actually unfolded that you see there in the prediction? Starting with the king being killed. What do you see? Thrown from the throne.
Well, you've mentioned the Jacobins and the Girondists, and I don't really have a handle on that, but clearly there were many factions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent, right? And because there were so many views of how this new republic, this new nation should be created, you know, they were never in agreement. They were always fighting amongst each other. They were, you know, killing each other. They couldn't get things done. And so, you know, we see 4 different constitutions during this this 10-year period. As well, of course, we see, you know, the most audacious and skillful citizens will usurp the empire. Well, I mean, look at the Mountain faction, what they did in the Committee of Public Safety that we'll talk about today, with, you know, basically just ruining the revolution in so many ways through the terror. And then you think about somebody else who was very skillful. Well, think of the coup d'etat of Napoleon Bonaparte coming in, you know, taking out the directory, putting in a consulate, then putting in an empire, and truly, you know, the revolution did change form without having reestablished freedom. And so they started where they began. They went from a monarchy to an empire, which is just another type of monarchy. And so, very, very interesting stuff. Well, if we think about this, then, of course, you know, unbridled passion. How does this relate? Of course, I mean, we've gone over the scripture a few times now, but really, I hope you'll take this away from the French Revolution. What's the lesson? What would you think, Walter? Or, I'm sorry, go ahead. Who was that, Christina?
Oh, I was just saying that unbridled passions never lead to anywhere good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. A horse is a beautiful animal, lots of power, but you know, if unbridled and scared and unable to see far enough ahead, it will run right off a cliff, perhaps. And that's truly what happened with France in this age here. Well, it's interesting because if we look at this, in light of Marat's hopes for the revolution and his predictions about its fate, how would he have judged the following results if he had lived to see them? These are just some of the results of the French Revolution. If we look here, we have equal rights proclaimed, Declaration of the Rights of Man, this, secular natural law, creation of many rights, etc. Feudalism abolished. The nobility was abolished for a time. The king was executed along with his wife. The church was reorganized by the state. We see atheism and deism and this cult of reason, increased secularization. Republican government established and reestablished with 4 different constitutions, internal and external warfare. For a decade, France was fighting against Britain and Prussia, the Netherlands, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have 300,000 people arrested, 40,000, that's a very conservative estimation, 40,000 executed during the terror, 250,000 dying in civil war, 2 million by 1850. Republic replaced by a monarchy, which would be the empire. The influence would transform Europe. Certainly the French Revolution, even today, is a very popular cause to celebrate. It's something that perhaps is a lot more in myth and symbol than maybe it even actually was in reality. It made the 19th century very different from the 18th century. It was, in many ways, the end of the ancient regime, the start of modernity in Europe, perhaps. Many scholars would argue for that. Modernity in its in all of its good and bad ways. Influence of the rise of different isms such as liberalism, socialism, egalitarianism, etc. All of these different causes cited the French Revolution as an inspiration in some way. If we look at these stages that we've seen before, once again, how to go from a monarchy to an empire in a decade. Here are some steps. Moderate, radical left, moderate, radical right. We have the Declaration of the Rights of Man to the Reign of Terror, corruption, and then an empire under Napoleon. And so certainly, it's very interesting as we think about how all of this came about, how, there were good intentions, and then they went wrong, and then they went terribly wrong, and then they just fizzled out and really almost went backwards in many ways. What role did the Reign of Terror play in crushing the hopes of the revolution it claimed to protect?
Well, the revolution seemed to want to have all men be equal, yet during the Reign of Terror, those who, I guess, had money, influence, power, they were not treated as equally as those who did not, I guess, and they were killed. Yeah,
thank you for that. And how interesting it is to have, sort of the rhetoric of equality, the worth of individuals rising up, popular government, etc., all the virtues of democracy that were sung over and over again in sort of a broken record tune, and then seeing basically people saying, oh yeah, well, and you don't fit, 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 and after a while, people realize that, wait a minute, whose republic is this? What does this even stand for? And who's calling the shots? Which is what we're going to talk about today. Thank you so much for that. Any other thoughts about how the terror tore down the revolution?
I think it's interesting what Marat said about cutting down the enemies of liberty. The question is who decides who the enemy of liberty is, and where do you ever stop? And I think that's what we see in the Reign of Terror, that all these pointing fingers just turn to nobody having liberty because they feared saying anything. I've heard that if somebody complained too loudly in line at the market, they might be turned in and things like that. It just kind of, in the fear of rooting out, or the intent to root out the enemies of liberty, they end up kind of stopping liberty and just making everybody afraid.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. That's a great answer. Well, if we look here, here's an overview of the Reign of Terror, and then we're going to go in depth. I've got lots of information for you today. So, really, Reign of Terror, 1793-94, really July to July. July 1793, July 1794. Once again, there are many different numbers out there, and in fact, historians will tell you that there's evidence that we'll just never really know because so much of what happened was destroyed in terms of records. But some of the things that we do know, about 3,000 to 4,000 were executed in Paris alone. 30,000 to 40,000 possibly were executed overall, though by many counts and books that I've read, very reputable sources, saying no, there were several hundreds of thousands. We just don't have the records. They were destroyed to cover their tracks, et cetera, or they were burned after, through rioting, and so a lot of people were killed in this terror. 500,000 people were imprisoned as suspects. 130,000 to 150,000 people emigrated from France to get away from what was going on. So just think of absolute social upheaval. I mean, as I think about this, I feel so grateful for some of the blessings that I have in my life. For to not see these things in some ways, is wonderful. We have Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette, the king and queen, both executed 1792. Was the end of the constitutional monarchy that Marat was attacking in Freedom is Lost. It was eventually replaced. Remember, there was the National Assembly before. Well, when they created the First Republic, they called it the National Convention. Basically did the same thing. There was a very strong attack against the old order of things. There was a new calendar replacing the sacred or Julian calendar with a calendar, where months were based on Republican names from nature, just basically secular names. A new clock, de-Christianization across the board, the goddess of reason, a new civil religion with this cult of the supreme being was supposed to replace Catholicism and the worship of a Christian god. The metric system, I'm sure you've all perhaps used it or had to do conversions to it or from it. Well, that came from the French Revolution. They said, we want to change things, and there we go, the metric system. So you can go home and tell your friends about that. Christian names all across the country, even road signs. If it said, the Holy Mother Street, would be changed to Forest Avenue, and many other things. Well, another overview here before we go into a little more depth. Really, you could look at it as these two factions, and there's so many different definitions of the term Jacobin that it is hard to nail it down in terms of who was who. But by one definition, you could say that the mountain, or les montagnards, were the most extreme version of the Jacobins, and that the Girondins were something else. Another way of looking at it is that the Jacobins were really people who favored a new popular democratic France. And so some scholars will tell you that, well, the Girondins and the Montagnards, they really were just sort of on different sides of the same party. But most often you really see them so far apart that it is very difficult to see them in the same party. And so really we have this mountain faction, called the mountain because they sat the highest up in the seats of the National Assembly and National Convention. And then the Girondins, or the Girondists, they were from this region, Gironde, in France. Some of the leaders of the mountain faction that ended up gaining control, Robespierre, we've heard of, Danton, Marat, and then Saint-Just. And then, as we know, Marat was killed by a Girondin supporter. They gained control of the Committee of Safety. And then Danton was executed because he fell out of line with what the most extreme members wanted to do. And then eventually, finally at the end, we have what's known as the Thermidorian reaction. You might say, why that funny name? Well, Thermidor was simply a month in the new calendar that was created, the month of Thermidor, because July had too much of a relation to religion. So they changed it to Thermidor, and so there was this reaction where there was a coup d'etat by members of the National Convention against Robespierre and Saint-Just, and then 98 others, and so the 27th of July, it all came to an end. So there's the terror in brief. If we looked in a little bit more detail, here's the mountain. I've tried to create a mountain for you with the pictures. Hopefully that will help to remember. We have Robespierre, the top left. We have Saint-Just, the top right. The bottom left, we have Danton, and then the bottom right, we have Marat. So there they Okay, well, if we look at that a little bit more about what was going on in France then at this time, 1789 to 92, we had this constitutional monarchy. The 21st of September, the First Republic was begun. Monarchy was abolished by the convention. The principal factors, we have the conservative Girondins and then the Montagnards, and they both approved of what was going on at this point. We'll see they'll really start to polarize with the further decisions. The 21st of January, 1793, we see the execution. Let's see. Oh, actually, sorry. This should be September. Well, anyway, okay. Yes, the execution of Louis XVI for treason. He had tried to flee the country, and then it was supported by the Montagnards, but opposed by the Girondins. They said, well, hey, maybe he's done bad things by trying to leave, but at the same time, we shouldn't have killed him for it. And so, because of that, this is when we start to see the polarization of the National Convention. Well, there's desertion by the leader of the French forces. After defeat by the Austrians, we have mounting civil war, the advance of enemy forces towards France. It creates this crisis in the National Convention between these Girondists and then the Mountain faction over whose ideologies would dictate the course of the revolution. By 1793, we have a Committee of Public Safety created to be the new executive body of the Republic, and this is when we really start to see things change. Well, if we look at the 2nd of June, 1793, leading Girondins arrested by the order of the Committee of Public Safety, and this leads then, after the arrest of these leaders, the Mountain faction gaining unquestionable control over the course of the revolution. By the 10th of July, we have the Mountain faction reorganizing the Committee of Public Safety, and then we'll see people who are placed in it who then dictate the rest of the course of this reign of terror. Well, Marat is murdered in the tub, as we talked about, on the 13th of July, which, interestingly enough, swung public opinion even more firmly against the Girondins and more firmly towards radicalism. And so when Robespierre was added to the committee on the 27th of July, he starts to wield this just immense power. And so he says, we need extreme policies to crush our enemies from within, and also to stop any signs of counter-revolution. And he renews, or excuse me, these powers that he wanted were renewed by the National Assembly or Convention through 1794. And so here we have this reign of terror. And he talks about terror in the document that you read. Well, we also see that there are external enemies, Austria, Britain, Prussia, etc., and they are France is fighting on all fronts at this point. In fact, 750,000 soldiers are drafted to fight these different groups that are attacking from without. Within, we have royalists, people who want a monarchy. We have people who are behind the Catholic Church, such as the non-jurors, those who didn't agree with the CCC. And then we have, of course, Girondins who are still hanging around in the country. Well, it's very interesting because the committee then starts to strike viciously after ordering 750,000 people to deal with the external threats. The committee starts to deal with internal opposition. 1793, Marie Antoinette is sent to the guillotine. The 31st of October, 21 prominent Girondin leaders are beheaded, and then suddenly we start to see this immense ramping up of the terror. Thousands of royalists, non-juror priests, Girondins, and others are charged with counter-revolutionary activities. They're brought before tribunals, they're convicted swiftly, and they're put to death with the guillotine, which, interestingly enough, even though it seems very, very gruesome to us, the committee used specifically because they thought it was the most humane way to execute somebody, that it was the most reasonable in the Enlightenment sense of the word reason. They said, oh, look, this is science at its best here. If we need to use it, let's make it as humane as possible. Well, if we look then, Paris executions, 2,639, 1515 of them died in June and July alone of 1794, and those 2 months are called the Great Terror. In northeastern France, we have revolution against the revolutionaries in power. So we have these royalist insurrectionists in the Vendée region, and they're killed in 3 months, 8,000 of them. We have about 3,000 in other regions. 40,000 total, could be hundreds of thousands by some estimations. If we look at the breakdown then of who ended up losing heads here, 8% were nobles, 6% clergy, 14% from the bourgeoisie or the middle class, 70% were peasants or workers, And then it's interesting to note that of these social groups, the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church suffered the greatest loss by far in proportion to its population. And this can be explained by some of the anti-religious hatred that led to the committee replacing the Julian calendar with a Republican calendar in October 1793. Basically, the committee tried to remake France into a nation based on reason and what they thought were Republican virtue and patriotism instead of one based on God. If we look here, the 23rd of November 1793, the Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, closed all churches in Paris. No more worship. That's it. And they tried to replace Christianity with the cult of reason. These acts were then repeated throughout the towns and cities of most of France. Of course, there were some holdout regions, but this was a widespread anti-religious attack put forth by this reign of terror and the Committee of Public Safety. It led to the imprisonment and murder of priests and the destruction of churches and religious symbols. Certainly a sad, dark time for France and the world. Well, also, the committee started to strike against supposed threats in the convention itself. The Hébertistes, who were even more extreme, if you could believe it, than the Mountain faction, and then the Dantonists, who thought that the terror had served its purpose and should be phased out. Well, they were ruthlessly executed as well. And so now we start to see leaders killing leaders, and there's a domino effect, as we'll notice. France starts to see successive victories against external threats, too, and so really the need for the terror starts to be questioned. People are saying, do we really need to continue this? There's conspiracy in the convention against Robespierre and his supporters, and so finally we have the Thermidorian reaction of the 27th of July in 94. Robespierre, Saint-Just, Couthon, another leader, and the 98 supporters, they're seized and they're beheaded the next day. And so the reign of terror came to an end very, very swiftly. The Thermidorians, a group that led to the overthrow of Robespierre because they overthrew him in that month, the month of Thermidor. They ruled against the convention until the end of 1794. And so while this is going on, the Jacobin clubs are closed throughout France. The tribunals are abolished, and then various extreme decrees of the First Republic and the Committee of Public Safety are repealed. And so they're trying to swing back to a more moderate phase. But in this moderate phase, under the Directory, we have this new constitution. There are 5 members of this executive body. They also have a bicameral legislature. But there's a financial crisis that they inherit. They can't deal with it very effectively because there's corruption. There are schisms between competing factions, and it ends up opening the door for Napoleon, as we'll talk about at our next class tomorrow. Well, if we look then and reason and relate after all of that information, and certainly lots of it that is just doesn't bring the warm fuzzies. How did the terror cause the First Republic to implode or collapse inwardly on itself? And what lessons do you learn from this implosion?
Well, for one thing, it created so much chaos that it allowed a power vacuum to be created that would obviously be filled by some maniac, or several, I should say.
Yeah, thank you for that. Right, bad things happen when you don't have order. Okay. What else would we say, as we've seen some more information about the terror?
It seems to me that things that are not based on true principles end up imploding on themselves. Even though in the very beginning there were good principles in the French Revolution, but when the terror began, they were not based on good principles anymore. Like you said, they took away Christianity. They took away the things that really give virtue to a people. And when you take all that away, then it just implodes. Because you have people who are vying for power, and their motives aren't necessarily so pure and virtuous.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful, Lori, that you brought up that word virtue, because it will be very interesting to see how Robespierre talks about virtue and his definition of virtue, and it has nothing to do with a godly life or virtuous principles that we would call virtuous today. And so it is, is it any wonder that this would happen when you're building your house on sand, right? Even my little daughter knows the song. right?
Right. Well, it's kind of like the Karl Marx version of virtue is different than, I think, what our God would call virtue. There are virtuous things in their philosophies, but well, it all goes back to the war in heaven, I guess, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, definitely. Well, I mean, when you start to look, and President Benson has said this, and we talked about it. But really, the war in heaven is continued upon earth. It was fought over agency, and one of the ways that Satan, tries to limit our agency in this life is through earthly governments. And so it's very, very interesting to see, how that plays out in so many ways. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about Satan's tricks in just a little bit. But as I think about this reign of terror and just how forcefully and vehemently and zealously it tried to get rid of religion, I mean, just to the point of just terrible, terrible atrocities. It makes me think about the society and the principles upon which it was founded, and then where they led. And it made me think, as I was thinking about that, of this great quote by Elder Neal A. Maxwell from 1979 in his talk, A More Determined Discipleship. Let's see, Walter, would you read the first paragraph for us, and then maybe Wendy the second one. Christina, are you here?
Yes.
Okay, great. Would you do the third one, and then Lori the fourth?
Sure.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Brothers and sisters, irreligion as the state religion would be the worst of all combinations. Its orthodoxy would be insistent and its inquisitors inevitable. Its paid ministry would be numerous beyond relief. Its Caesars would be insufferably condescending. Its majorities, when faced with clear alternatives, will make the Barabbas choice, as did a mob centuries ago when Pilate confronted them with the need to decide.
Your discipleship may see the time when such religious convictions are discounted. N.J. Sobran also said, a religious conviction is now a second-class conviction, expected to step deferentially to the back of the secular bus and not to get uppity about it.
This new irreligious imperialism seeks to disallow certain opinions simply because those opinions grow out of religious convictions. Resistance to abortion will be seen as primitive. Concern over the institution of the family will be viewed as untrendy and unenlightened.
In its mildest form, irreligion will merely be condescending toward those who hold traditional Judeo-Christian values. It is in its more harsh forms, as is always the case with those whose dogmatism is blinding, the secular church will do what it can to reduce the influence of those who still worry over standards, such as those in the Ten Commandments. It is always such an easy step from dogmatism to unfair play, especially so when the dogmatists believe themselves to be dealing with primitive people who do not know what is best for them. The secular bureaucrat's burden, you see.
Thanks. So what do we think about this here? There's a lot of great things there.
I can't believe he said it in 1979.
Right.
It's definitely a prophet.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I think we see that the people who are religious, it's like, oh, how cute, you believe in God, rather than anything that is valued.
Yeah, that brings to mind a story that my wife has told me. Right, Christina, about the Lilla Guman. Would you want to explain that one on your mission?
Yeah, I served a mission in Sweden, and that's a very atheistic country. It was often they have this little saying that you say to like little children, little girls. Lilla Guman just means like what a cutie. And whenever I tried to talk to people, sometimes they would pat me on the head and say Lilla Guman and keep walking, to kind of say, oh, what a cutie, you're trying to teach me about God. You don't really know. And so this quote, it applies to the French Revolution and it applies to today. And I think those people really are, good intentioned in their own strange way, that they think, oh, these poor people that believe in God, if only they were enlightened. But really, it just leads to just terrible things. And so it's just like the French Revolution, where at the beginning maybe they were well-intentioned, but they just took it the wrong way, and because they cut God out of the picture, it failed.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. And this is just really, I mean, today's class is such a great example, of such a lesson from history about what happens when you take God out of the picture. I mean, just, sometimes it's easy to maybe forget, how terrible consequences can be when, you're just at the beginning stages of something. But to see the end stage, to see the final implosion, here in something like the Reign of Terror, it has great lessons, for us and for the future. Well, if we look here, then, when we think about Robespierre in this very interesting, scary document, he talks about the fundamental principle of the democratic or popular government, that is, the essential spring which makes it move. What does he talk about there?
It's virtue, and as you pointed out earlier, his opinion, he describes virtue as a love of country and its laws, and that it works hand in hand with terror.
Right.
Otherwise, it's too weak.
Right. Yeah, he talks about terror as an emanation from virtue, that terror protects virtue, and it's very, very interesting here, this extreme, patriotism, this isn't the right word, nationalism, dogmatism, but really it's this ultra, virtue is not the word. Ultra. I'm really at a loss but certainly I read it and I shake my head. But really, if we think about this here, he talks about how, because this is something that perhaps, in another sense of the word virtue, we might feel differently about. When only the government lacks virtue, there remains a resource in the people's virtue. But when the people itself is corrupted, liberty is already lost. What do we think about that?
Well, it's true, assuming we're talking about the kind of virtue I'm thinking of instead of the kind he's thinking of.
Right.
Because, ultimately, if the people are still choosing what's right, there's a good chance it could be corrected.
Right. Sure. And if, for example, if you look at a people breaking away from a government, right, and because they had virtue, being able to start a good government, well, you need look no farther than the United States, right? And so certainly, virtue doesn't reside in the government, though hopefully it does. But when it doesn't, right, it should at least reside in the people. That's the most important repository of virtue. And so it's very interesting to see, that popular sovereignty, when that popular sovereignty isn't virtuous, look out. That's when you're in trouble. Well, what does he say about this relationship between public and private interest in a democracy? Because it goes into his notion of virtue.
Maybe what page you're talking about?
Let's see. If you go here to page 49, the first new paragraph or the second paragraph, it is also true.
That was his definition also of virtue, that if your love for country and of law would lead you to choose public interest over your own particular interests, which, again, I would agree. I think, like Heidi has said earlier, that that's one of the shameful things about Americans now is that we vote for candidates who will improve our particular cause instead of the cause of freedom and liberty.
Right. Definitely. Think of it. Rousseau's notion of the general will is so easily lost in self-interest, because we stop thinking about, wait, what's really best versus, wait, what do I want? Forget about what's best, but what do I want? What will help me? What will give me an advantage? In my little sphere. And so certainly, he's talking about this virtue, this ultra-nationalism. And like I said before, nationalism is just too weak a word, even though it's a stronger word than patriotism. But this ultra-nationalism with a very negative connotation, this sort of ultra, sort of strange sense of purity of purpose that, you're so behind behind the country, that you are willing to put up with things like the terror, and you sit quietly by while your neighbors are taken from their homes and executed because of this, that, or the other. And so of course in Robespierre's virtue, public always comes first. Private interests take a back seat. Even though, of course, as Wendy said, talking about what Heidi's brought up several times, putting others before yourself, putting the public before the private, right, isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a very good thing. Well, it's interesting because if we look at terror, what is terror to Robespierre? And just so you know, the word terror used in the way that it's used started with the French Revolution. We've got a lot of words from the French Revolution that became very, very popular because of it. Citizen, terror are just two of them. What does he talk about terror? Also on page 49. Or excuse me, page 50.
That it's justice.
It's justice, yeah.
Justice. Yeah,
An emanation
terror.
of virtue.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Wendy.
I just said an emanation of virtue.
Yes, thank you so much for that. He says, terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. It is not so much a special principle as it is a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to our country's most urgent needs. And so he talks about this relationship, between virtue and terror. And to Robespierre, what is this relationship?
He's one of those the end justifies the means kind of guys.
Mm-hmm.
Terror and beheadings are justified to maintain this virtue or love of country that he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. He says, virtue without terror is fatal. Terror without which virtue is powerless. Right? So if virtue in his mind is this ultra, nationalistic purity of purpose, then the bodyguard is terror, accompanying it wherever it goes to fight off its supposed foes.
As long
okay.
as he's the one who gets to decide who's beheaded.
That's right.
Then it's virtuous. Terror is virtuous.
That's right. Well, and that's the problem, right? That's the problem with arbitrary will. Excuse me, arbitrary will. When it is the rule of man instead of the rule of law, this is what happens. And so it's very interesting. And of course, going a step further, the rule of law should ideally be the rule of God. And so, okay, well, if we look at this here, then who deserves terror to him? How would you classify these people? I mean, he mentions some specific people, but how would you classify them?
Well, he says only peaceable citizens deserve protection, and the royalists are enemies.
Mm-hmm. That's right. If you think that a constitutional monarchy should be reinstated, if you're for the Catholic Church, if you are a counter-revolutionary, either politically or morally, as he puts it, all of these people are as guilty as the tyrants they serve, he says, and therefore, we need to have a despotism, liberty's despotism against tyranny, because we are the pure liberty. The pure liberty must fight against tyranny wherever it is found. And so therefore, the end justifies the means. Well, this, of course, is scary stuff, and it really can relate to Alma 30:52 through 53. And Korihor put forth his hand and wrote, saying, I know that I am dumb, for I cannot speak, and I know that nothing, save it were the power of God, could bring this upon me. Yea, and I always knew that there was a God. But behold, the devil hath deceived me, for he appeared unto me in the form of an angel, and said unto me, Go and reclaim this people, for they have all gone astray after an unknown God. And he said unto me, There is no God, yea, and he taught me that which I should say. And I have taught his words, and I taught them because they were pleasing unto the carnal mind. And I taught them even until I had much success, insomuch that I verily believed that they were true. And for this cause I withstood the truth, even until I have brought this great curse upon me. How would you relate that?
Well, the devil has many ways of spreading his propaganda that there is no God. He taught Korihor away, and here he's teaching Robespierre away. I'd be interested to know whether Robespierre is like Korihor in that he didn't believe it at first, but had taught it so long that he came to believe it. I don't know. That makes me curious.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would be interested in that answer as well. What were you going to say, Lori? I think that was you.
Well, he sounds very humanistic, which is very popular at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But this humanism of it's pleasing to the carnal mind that I am a god. I don't need a god. I am in and of myself a god unto myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so Korihor just sounds like a humanist along with Robespierre.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that this is true of people. All of us are given the light of Christ. All of us. Every single human being. And deep down inside, I think everybody knows. We just have so much that we embrace of what we've been taught or what we philosophize or whatever, but everybody deep down inside, I think, believes it because we all have the light of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I also think it's so interesting, too. I mean, think about Robespierre. He's writing about virtue. He's using the word virtue. He's talking about purity. He's talking about, oh, this will be best for the country. We're going to help people, equality, et cetera, et cetera. But yet, here he is taking certain principles and he's twisting them, and he's taking them to an extreme that is more than unhealthy. And because of that, we see that just like Satan is the great counterfeiter, right? Robespierre and the principles and the spirit behind what he was doing, it was a counterfeit. It was a counterfeit of true liberty, a counterfeit of true Republican principles. And so truly, Satan is the father of lies. He can transform himself into an angel of light. He appeared as an angel here to Korihor, and in so many ways, Robespierre was setting himself up in a type of Satan in terms of some of the same tools, and certainly they were Satan-inspired tools. And so I think this is a very interesting thing to think about. Well, the last little thing here, Edmund Burke, he laments the death of Marie Antoinette, and of course it's kind of a romantic piece. He's going on and on about, her virtue, chivalry is dead, this and that. But he does say some interesting things about, the character and the meaning of the revolution and how it changed because of the terror. And so just as we wrap up here, this last paragraph, page 51, who would like to read that for us? This is Edmund Burke, the English Observer, talking about the character of the French Revolution and how it changed because of the terror.
Page 51?
Yes.
The last paragraph?
Please.
I will. And Burke was British, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. Never, never more shall we behold that generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of the heart which kept alive even in servitude itself the spirit of an exalted freedom, the unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise is gone. It is gone, that sensibility of principle, that chastity of honor, which felt a stain like a wound, which inspired courage whilst it mitigated ferocity, which ennobled whatever it touched, and under which vice itself lost half its evil by losing all its grossness.
Thank you for that. So what is he saying here?
Well, I have trouble glorifying proud submission and dignified obedience to monarchy, that kind of, he says even in servitude itself. I have trouble glorifying that, but I feel his pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's interesting too because, he talks about how really, let's look at how we've seen all of this grossness, right? This unbridled passion and where it's led. And just to close, because we're out of time, unfortunately. But if we relate this song to this great relate Burke's ideas to this great hymn by President Charles Penrose, who wrote it actually after he was starting to become upset at something that was going on. He was accused, and anyway. But he went up to his room and he wrote this instead of instead of getting angry. But he wrote this here, school thy feelings, O my brother, train thy warm, impulsive soul. Do not its emotions smother, but let wisdom's voice control. School thy feelings, there is power in the cool, collected mind. Passion shatters reason's tower, makes the clearest vision blind. And he goes on. But, of course, we have this great lesson then of the French Revolution that we need to bridle our passions or we will see destruction. Not only the destruction of nations, but the destruction of our very own souls. This lesson truly can be applied symbolically to our lives in so many ways because, of course, most likely we're not going to be involved in a reign of terror and, a guillotine scheme, this, that, and the other, but certainly how many times do we let passion shatter reason's tower in our lives? How many times do we let anger or lust or impatience or whatever else, a whole host of these passions, become unbridled, and then they lead us to losing the spirit, making choices that we regret, distancing ourselves from God, and certainly, if we don't clean those things up, passion will keep us from celestial glory. It will thwart the whole purpose of this earth and our time on it, and so we need to be vigilant. This isn't just about the French. This is about us. This is about every day, and trying to control those things. And when we fall down, getting up and repenting through the atonement of Christ. I have a testimony in doing that, and I certainly need to do it as much, if not more, than anybody else. And so I'm grateful that we had this time to talk together, and I look forward to our class tomorrow. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.